بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. For the 3 days that we've been together, we've been discussing this topic of moving toward knowing God, so that we can know Allah better, believe in Him stronger, and inshallah serve the purpose of serving Him in a better way than we have until now. Yesterday, we discussed this idea about how we can't know God. There are certain ways that people sometimes think that they can know God, and those are ways that are illegitimate or impotent, incapable of reaching who Allah is. We're going to move on today and tomorrow inshallah and talk about ways that we can know God. But there's one idea that I think we need to address before we do that. So yesterday we talked about the fact that we can't see God. We can't use our physical senses to know God because He's beyond those physical senses. We also said that we can't use our imagination to imagine what God is like, because anything that we imagine is just a creation that I've conjured in my mind, and that is not God. I can't conjure Allah in all of His magnificence, His unlimited nature. So whatever I conjure is my own creation. It's not the creator of me and my thoughts. And third, he said that we also can't access Allah or know Allah in His essence. Now the first two of those, the reason why we can't use those faculties is because the faculties are too weak. Both our physical senses and our imagination are all limited to the physical world or to the mental world. They can't reach Allah, who is beyond all of this. The third element, the fact that we can't reach His essence, His that, is because that is something that is unknowable to us, it's inaccessible to us. For one thing, it's infinite. Right? When we talk about knowing something, that means we can comprehend it, we can kind of encompass it with our mind, and know all aspects of it. If something is infinite, and I use a finite tool, like my faculties, and how can I encompass something that's infinite with something finite? Recite the salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So the problem is that I don't have access to the that of Allah, His essence, because my faculties are too weak, and in fact His essence is something beyond what any of His creatures can comprehend, even the greatest of His creatures. So the question remains, if that's the case, if all these paths, these three paths that we laid out are all closed to us, then does Allah even exist? Right? Because if I can't find evidence for something, I can't touch it, I can't feel it, I can't see it, I can't even imagine it, then are we really talking about something real? Or is this really something that's imagined, and we just claim that it exists and pretend like He exists, when actually we have no evidence to say that He exists? Right? Evidence, a lack of evidence, sometimes we think that the lack of evidence of something tells us that that thing itself doesn't exist. That's a logical fallacy, but that sounds pretty nice. It sounds like a pretty sound reasoning. If I don't have evidence of something, then what's to say that thing exists? And that's a valid question. If I don't have evidence of something, there is a question, does that thing really exist? But it doesn't prove that it doesn't exist. Right? Just because these particular paths are closed doesn't mean we have no path to Allah. We'll speak about 4 different paths that we do have to know Allah, but these particular paths are either impotent because they're not powerful enough to reach Him, or He Himself, in certain aspects of Himself, in His infinity, He's incomprehensible to us. Right? So when we say that these paths are closed to us, it doesn't mean that He doesn't exist. This is something that's just a figment of our imagination. When we say that we can't know everything about Allah, that doesn't mean that we can't know anything about Allah. There are definitely, we know His existence, and we'll talk about this in the coming 2 lectures. We know that He exists. There's absolute positive evidence within our own soul, and we can argue it, we can rationally also establish that He does exist without a doubt. And then all the revelation that we get and the guidance that we get from Him also helps us to corroborate what we feel, what we know, and lets us know absolutely that He does exist. But part of the divine guidance also tells us what the limitations are in our relationship with Him. So there are aspects of Allah that we have no access to because it's too far for us, it's too sublime for us to even comprehend. Right? Now, does that mean if I can't know all about Allah, does that mean that I'm going to question everything about Allah and say I don't even believe in anything? No, whatever I have evidence for, I have to believe. And then even that for which I don't have evidence, but I know that this God is something sublime, I should also believe in that. It's as part of Iman bil Ghayb, but it comes after having established all of these facts, all of these knowable, provable, arguable facts. Alright, so we shouldn't think that saying that we can't access the That of Allah, the essence of Allah, is the same thing as saying basically, don't ask any questions. If you ask too many questions, then then you're on the wrong path. No, ask whatever questions you want, but there's a point where you go where it's above your pay grade. Now you don't have the faculties to even think about the answer. And if you can't even think about the answer, then what's the point of asking the question? Because whatever answer you get is going to be something you will be unable to comprehend. I don't know if this is a relevant example depending on what your careers are, what your expertise, levels of expertise is, but for someone like me, I'm not an expert in the technical side of things, right? So how a computer works, how a phone works, I don't know the mechanics, I don't know the coding and the hardware, all these different things. I know how to use my phone, but I don't know how to build a phone or how to analyze how the phone works. So for me to come to a person who knows how to design that phone and knows how to program that phone and ask him some details about how that phone works on a level that's appropriate for him is really a silly question, a foolish question, because I don't have any of the prerequisites required to understand his answer. It's something beyond my pay grade. It's beyond even what I've been exposed to. I have none of the prerequisites to be able to start comprehending whatever answer he's going to give me. So is it really worthwhile asking such a question? Now it's different for someone who has those prerequisites, who are on the same page, so two people who are both experts in the same area, they can speak about those things. So that example is not exactly like Allah, because there's no one who knows Allah in His essence and in His infinity. But from another perspective, we understand that there are certain things that are too complicated, too vast for us to be able to address, and so it's not a worthwhile pursuit. So when we say that exploring or asking about the That of Allah, the essence of Allah, is something we should stay away from, it's not haram from a fiqh perspective. It's not prohibited in that way. Don't ask any questions about this. Really what these ahadith are telling us is that if you do, it's not going to lead to anything positive, and in fact it'll lead to something negative. Right? We're not called on to ask questions about everything, even if we don't have the preparation to receive the answer. In fact, that's a foolish way to ask questions. Those doubts and questions we were talking about yesterday, if I ask, sometimes people are in this misconception that the pursuit of all knowledge is good. I should always explore everything. I should hear every controversy. I should hear every side of every argument. That is tantamount to not knowing how to swim and throwing yourself off the deep end. Right? That's a foolish proposition to throw myself into the water when I don't have the preparation to deal with the deep water and swim. Now, if I know how to swim, if I've gone through the stages where I can now swim, now for me to go into the deep water, it's fine because I'm prepared for it. I know how to deal with it. Right? But this idea that you should ask every question and you should explore everything and expose yourself to every idea, this is not a very sensible idea. You can prepare yourself. First of all, you should filter out and think of what are the relevant things to explore, what are the relevant things that are actually useful for me, where if I engage in this discussion, if I ask this question to receive an answer, is it going to benefit me in any way, or is it really going to be of no benefit at all? Because there are many areas of knowledge that you can say you're knowing something, you're learning something, but the knowledge itself is completely worthless. I don't know, an extreme example would be, for instance, sports facts. There's no purpose, there's no benefit in knowing all the details of players and their statistics and these kinds of things. It has absolutely no benefit. It's a pastime, so it's not haram. You can do it as a pastime, but realize it's a waste of time. And so instead of wasting time with other things, you can waste your time with this, but it is a waste of time at the end of the day. Right? So asking questions and researching something like that that's useless, there's no point in it. So first of all, filter out those things that are worthless, think about those things that are worthwhile, and then go through the steps to try to work your way up to the level where you can ask the questions that you need answers to. Don't expect that you can ask a question at a high level that is very complicated without any preparation, and that the answer you get will somehow be beneficial to you. It might actually lead you to more confusion and increase your doubt. Right? So exposing yourself, for instance, on the questions of the existence of God, exposing yourself to the arguments for atheism by just reading a Richard Dawkins book, for instance, on your own, without any preparation, that's a pretty dangerous thing to do. Not because his arguments are strong, but because the appearance of those arguments is strong. And when the appearance of something is strong, when it's sugar-coated, when it appears to be a very strong argument, it's very difficult for the undiscerning mind to know what's true and what's false. And it's very easy to give in to that because it's convincing. Not because it's true or it has any ounce of truth in it, but because it's presented very impressively. Right? And so it's unwise to pursue every kind of knowledge, and that's the point. The question about that of Allah, it's prohibited because it's something too difficult to fathom, and there's no point in trying to access that aspect of Allah, the infinity of Allah. There are aspects of Allah that we can access, and we must think about, and those are the parts that we can understand to some extent. And even there, we have to know to what extent am I understanding something, and at what point do I have to say Allah is Subhanallah. Right? Subhanallah means Allah is far above, He's exalted above what I'm ascribing to Him. So if I say Allah knows, Allah is, for instance, greater than everything, from a perspective that's true, but if I am not careful, I can also, by saying He's greater than everything, I might also be thinking about Allah in a greatness that is less than what He actually is. If I think about Allah as being great, and I'm thinking about Him as being really big. So we have our solar system, we have the Milky Way galaxy, which is even bigger, we have the whole universe, which is even bigger, and there's some limit to the universe, right? There's some border, there's some boundary around the universe where it's expanding and then it's going to contract and all of this. That's how astronomers understand the way the universe is, beyond which there's nothing. If I think, well, however big the universe is, Allah is just a little bit bigger than that. I'm saying Allah is bigger than everything, but my conception of what it means for Allah to be big is size. That, for instance, the distance from this finger to this finger of Allah is longer, it's this many more light years than the distance between this end and that end of the universe. That's not how Allah is big. That's not how He is great. So I'm saying the right thing, but my conception of what it means to be great is something that's too narrow. It's not worthy of Allah. His greatness is not in size, it's in something else. And so the Ahlul Bayt will advise us, don't say Allah is greater than everything. Allahu Akbar min kulli shay. Say Allah is Akbar min an yusaf. He's greater than that He can be described. Again, pushing us to this infinity. Whatever you say to describe Him, He's bigger than that, greater than that, further than that. He's exalted above whatever attributes we might give to Him. All right, recite with salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. Let's move on then today. I want to discuss today and then probably tomorrow and perhaps the third day as well. What are the paths that we can use to know God? There are 4 paths in particular that I want to spend some time with. The first is known as the Fitrah. Alright, we'll discuss what the Fitrah is today, inshallah. The second path is that we can use certain rational arguments to know God, to establish His existence, and to establish certain attributes that He has, knowledge and wisdom and so on and so forth. Thirdly, there are textual pieces of evidence in the Quran and Revelation that Allah has given us, and via the channel of the Ahlul Bayt, what they have taught us about who God is. So by looking at the text of the Quran and looking at the text of the ahadith and the du'as and all the texts that the Ahlul Bayt have given to us, we can know how they have described Allah, and that helps us then. That's a pathway, a very important pathway for us to know who Allah is, to know His attributes. And a fourth way is to actually build a relationship with Him. right? Through worship, through dua, through conversation, through interacting with Allah, we can build and deepen that relationship that we have with Him and come to know Him better in a very practical and a very real way because we are interacting with Him. So these are the four paths I want to lay out. Today, inshallah, we'll talk about the first one, which is the fitrah. This term fitrah comes from the word fatara, which means to create. It's one of the many words in Arabic that means to create something, to make something. We have khalaqa, we have bari'a, we have fatara, and there are ansha'a, ja'ala. We have many different words, and all of them are applied to Allah in some way. This fatara, Allah's fatir as-samawati wal-ard. And He's the one who created the heavens and the earth. And you can say He's fatir of human beings as well. When we say that we have a fitrah, what that means is that there's a particular way in which Allah has created us. This pattern in Arabic, fitrah, fi'la, it communicates the way something is done. So the verse in the Quran is a very easy address. Surah Al-Rum, verse number 30. So 30. Surah 30, verse number 30. It's known as Ayatul Fitrah. It says, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا. Turn yourself, devote yourself to the deen completely and unswervingly. Right? Hanif means turn away from everything else and turn yourself towards the deen of Allah. فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. In so doing, as you turn yourself towards the deen and devote yourself towards deen, this way of life that Allah has laid down for us, we will also be in hand, we will be abiding by this fitrah, which is a particular way that Allah has created us. It's the way that Allah has created us. He's created all people. So every human being is created in a particular way. There's some commonality between all of us in our emotions, our desires, our instincts, our instinctual knowledge. There's a commonality between all human beings, among all human beings. And that's the fitrah Allah allati fatara an-nasa alayha. This particular way in which Allah has created people. This fitrah is unchanging. It's unable to be changed. It can be, we can be distracted away from it. Its effects can be muted and muffled. But the essential fitrah that's created within us stays. La tabdila li khalqillah. There's no way to change this way that Allah has created us. He's programmed us like this, and you can't change that programming. We are focused on these certain things that Allah has created us to be focused on, with these certain emotions, certain attractions, certain likes and wants and dislikes. لا تبديل لخلق الله ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. This deen that is the ultimate focal point of this fitrah, this is the upright deen. But most people don't recognize it and don't know. Alright, so this verse introduces this idea of the fitrah. And the fitrah is a very important idea in our Islamic thought. Right? So Allah has created us in such a way that we have certain, you can call them instincts. Certain instincts as human beings. We're not talking about just the instincts. Well, and part of it is the instincts that He's created animals with as well. But we don't focus too much on those because those are things we have in common with animals. Right? So the instinct to scratch when you itch, to blink when something comes into your eye. That's an instinct. You don't learn it, you don't consciously do it, but you do it, any animal does it as well. But there are instincts that we have that are unique to human beings, and they're also universally present in human beings. So for instance, humans are created to be curious. We have a sense of curiosity. We want to know. We want to ask questions. We want to know how things work. We want to know what's going to happen if I do this. Right? Those of you who have young kids, it's a reality for you right now, and they're the most curious because they have this raw fitrah. Unfortunately, sometimes with time, if they are not given the right kind of environment and education and upbringing, then you can dull that curiosity. Because they see that no matter how many questions they ask, no matter how curious they are, their curiosity is not fed. They're not satisfied. They're not given good answers. They're not engaged with. And so they lose a little bit of that curiosity. It's still there with them. La tabdila li khalqillah says it's with them, but it becomes dulled and it becomes replaced with feelings of shame, for instance, for asking too many questions. Right? But that's that's part of the fitrah, is this curiosity that we have to seek knowledge and to learn things. Another part of our fitrah is that we love what's good. In particular, a good example is justice, fairness. Every human being loves fairness. If you ask someone, do you want me to be fair with you or do you want me to be unfair with you? Of course they're going to say, be fair with me. That's what I desire. And why do people act unfairly? If that fitrah is there, it's not that they think that they're being unfair, but they justify being unfair, because they think there's some other greater good that they have to accomplish. I'm being unfair, for instance, because everyone else is unfair. If I'm fair, everyone else can be unfair with me, I'll receive the short end of the stick. And so they justify, the whole idea of justify is that the balance is out of whack, right? And I want to restore justice by coming up with enough reasons to make it seem like it's okay that I'm doing the wrong thing. So it seems like I'm acting fairly when actually I'm acting unfairly, right? That's what justification is. So we naturally love fairness. We naturally love goodness. I would love for you to be kind to me, to be respectful to me, to be compassionate to me, to be generous with me. And vice versa. You would also love the same things from me. And we have a dislike for the opposite of all those things. You would hate for me to be disrespectful to you. You would hate for me to be unjust with you, to be unfair with you. Right? Those are natural things. Those are innate things, part of our fitrah that all human beings have in common. Right? So one of the aspects of the fitrah is that we are naturally programmed to know Allah. We are pre-programmed with this homing device. All human beings, in their natural state, as their mind develops, as that child becomes a little bit older and starts to think, is naturally drawn towards Allah and naturally knows Allah. This knowledge of Allah is something that is similar to the feelings that we have. Let me draw one distinction. So oftentimes this idea of fitrah gets short shrift in our books of theology. We're usually trying to prove that God exists. Theologians and theological books, if you read a book on Allah and His attributes, one of the first discussions is how can we prove that God exists? And so typically the way that the discussion goes, the first thing that the scholar will mention is the fitrah. You innately have this knowledge of God. But immediately we have to say, this is not a good argument. If you say you don't believe in God, and I come to you and say, yes you do, look inside of you. Don't you feel that God exists? That's not a very good argument. That's not going to satisfy you at all. You'll say, wait, what are you talking about? Bring me some actual evidence, some actual argument. This is not an argument. Just say, look inside of you and see, don't you feel that God exists? What does that do? So the fitrah is not meant as an argument. It's not meant to be used as an argument. The rational arguments that we'll talk about tomorrow, inshallah, those are there to convince someone and say, here's the reason why I believe God exists. Think of this distinction. If I ask you, for instance, if you're hungry. If I ask you if you're hungry, you will simply say, yes, if you are. Why? How do you know that you're hungry? Because you feel it. You feel your stomach growling, you feel the emptiness, whatever it is that you feel when you feel hungry, you feel that. Now if I ask you to prove it to me, that becomes a lot more difficult. How do you prove that you're hungry? And you can think maybe you can, draw blood sugar and show that your sugar is low, for instance, or something like that. Or take an X-ray or some sort of imaging to show that your stomach is empty. And you can come up with some things like that, but it's more difficult than saying that, yes, I'm hungry. Why? Because I feel it. I know it, because it's my belly, it's my stomach, it's my senses, I know I'm hungry. Are you certain you're hungry? Absolutely. I have absolutely no doubt that I'm hungry because I feel it. Can you prove it? It's a little bit more difficult. Right, that's the nature of this kind of knowledge. It is knowledge. I know that I'm hungry. This kind of knowledge, in the technical term, it's called presential knowledge. It's knowledge that you know because the feeling is there. The knowledge is actually with you, inside of you. It doesn't go through concepts and it doesn't go through the mind. Once you start proving it and arguing that, yes, I'm hungry because of such and such, now we're talking about ideas. We're talking about concepts in the mind, that's a whole different thing. So we know how we feel. I know that I exist. Why? Because I exist. I know. I am with myself. I know that I exist. I don't have to think about whether I exist or prove it to myself. I know that I'm hungry. I know that I'm hot and I'm sweating right now. Why? Because the sweat is coming down my forehead and I know that I'm hot. Right? So this is presential knowledge. Our fitrah is like that. We know within ourselves that there's this cause, this God that has created us, and He has provided all of our existence. Everything that we have is from Him. We know this internally. This is why one of the reasons, if you look around the globe and you look at the religious leanings of people, the vast majority of people believe in God in one way or another, following some religion or another. If nothing else, the most watered down version of what people think of as God is like, they'll say some higher power. Someone who created me, someone who has control. Right? That's the most watered down version of what people think of as God. But there's always a belief in God. The people who say there absolutely is no God, the atheist is the very small minority. And that too because it's a very illogical position to say there's no God because I have no evidence that there's God. It's the same argument I presented before. The lack of evidence, even if you say there's no evidence in the physical world, because my senses, I can't see Him, I can't touch Him, and that doesn't prove that He doesn't exist, because this is not the only part of existence. There's so much more to existence besides the physical world. So anyway, let's set that aside. But the atheist position is a very weak position, and it's a very minority position. The vast majority of people believe in God. Why do they believe in God? Well, the main reason is because of this fitrah. I don't know if you've ever realized, when you read the Quran, there is no verse in the Quran that argues and says that they say God doesn't exist, here's the proof that He does exist. The Quran never addresses atheism. The doubt that the Quran addresses over and over again is people are worshiping the wrong God. So they are theists. Polytheists are theists. They do believe in God. They've invented a bunch of different gods to control different parts of existence when there's only one God. So their problem is in identifying what the wrong God and limiting Him and dividing Him up, not in not believing in God at all. And so the Quran never even addresses the idea of atheism. It just tries to correct the wrong ideas about God and bring them back in line with the reality of the one God. Right? So this fitrah is a reality that is there within human beings. And while it's not a very good argument, I can't argue, like I said before, and say God exists. Why? Because look inside of you and you'll feel it. Nonetheless, in its reality and understanding God and building a relationship with God, this fitrah is vital. That is actually the main way the main tool that we have within ourselves to know Allah. Think of it as a small flame that will never be extinguished. La tabdila li khalqillah. So this flame is always there. It cannot be extinguished. It can be again covered up, and you can do different things to dull the effects, but it's always burning inside. There's always hope that this person will finally recognize what he knows in his gut. Our job, especially in that fourth path that I mentioned, in building a relationship with Allah through worship, through prayer, through dua, and even in the second path, which is these rational arguments, is to try to awaken this fitrah, to kindle this flame into something more. Right? So that gut feeling, instead of it just being a dull feeling, a vague awareness of Allah, we want to kindle it to the point where we know God and we can say that I see God before me, right? Like Imam Ali says, بِحَقَائِقِ الْإِيمَانِ. Right? The high levels of faith, with my heart, I'm able to see God, and He is present for me. I would not worship a God that I couldn't see, and I didn't have that much certainty, and as though I'm seeing Him with my own eyes. I can't see Him with my eyes because my eyes are weak, but my heart knows Him with absolute certainty. More, and there is no room for even increasing that certainty for someone like Amirul Mu'mineen or Rasulullah. So that fitrah is extremely important, and we should pay attention to it. We should think about this verse. So what it is saying actually is that you already have a fitrah within you that it serves this function. You already know God. So by accepting the deen that Allah is sending down through the Quran and through Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt, that deen which is coming from the external world to teach you and guide you is going to dovetail with this fitrah, which is what you naturally desire and want. Everything that you want in your heart and the way Allah has created you is going to dovetail with the guidance that's coming to you from the outside. From the Quran, from Revelation, from the guidance of the Ahlul Bayt. So they never say anything, for instance, that's illogical. Right? Because part of our fitrah is our intellect. Things have to make sense before I'm going to accept them as true. So we'll see that in Islam, in all the Islamic guidance, anything that's authentic is never going to be something that's going to contradict our intellect, where our intellect will say, no, it's absolutely false. I can prove that it's false, and here the Quran is telling us that it's true. You'll never see that. Now, you'll have times when it seems like the Quran is saying something that seems to be in conflict, but upon further reflection, then you realize that no, it makes perfect sense, but I didn't know enough, or I hadn't thought of it this way, and you're able to resolve it. Because complex ideas, sometimes they're given an illusion of being one way, but as you reflect more and work more on it and dig deeper, then you realize that actually, no, that makes perfect sense. So that happens. But you'll never see something that's a total contradiction to what the intellect says, or to what reality is in the external world. Everything that's in the deen will fit with what our fitrah says. Even I gave this example a few days ago. All of our desires that our nafs has, all those the seeking of pleasure through all these different carnal desires, this is also part of our fitrah. Allah has created us that way. So we see that the deen of Islam doesn't come and say, I know I made you so you have certain desires for something, but actually, you can't act on that at all. The deen never says that. It'll say, I've created this desire in you. Here are the bounds and the limits that you have to observe in fulfilling that desire. Here's how you should pursue this desire in a way that's halal and that's within moderation. And that actually is in your best interest. Denying yourself that pleasure is actually very bad. It's bad for you. And it'll come back to bite you. So the deen comes in and it meshes with that fitrah, it dovetails with the fitrah, and it helps us to fulfill our desires in a way that is actually in our best interest and is going to provide the greatest fruits.
Allahumma
There is an interesting verse in Surah Al-A'raf that also relates to the fitrah. And there are also lots of ahadith that relate to this verse. So let me share this verse with you, and I think inshallah, we'll have enough time to discuss it at least in part, and then we can continue until tomorrow. So these are the two verses in Surah Al-A'raf, verses 172 and 173, known as Ayatul Mithaq. Right, so a mithaq is a covenant, an agreement between us and Allah, where He has made us promise and we have promised, and now we're bound to this promise as a mithaq. The verse says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ. Remember the time when Allah brought forth from the children of Adam all of their progeny. وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. So He arrayed all of creation in front of Himself, and then He made them testify against themselves, saying, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ? Am I not your Lord? قَالُوا بَلَى. All humanity replied and said, of course you are. Why did Allah do this? Why did He ask the question? Why did He make us all reply? And why did we all say bala? What was the purpose of this whole exchange? أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا خَافِلِينَ. For two reasons. So that on the Day of Judgment, first of all, you shouldn't be able to say, we're heedless. We didn't know that you were our God. You can't say that because you met God. He asked you, am I not your Lord? And you agreed that, yes, of course you are my Lord. So how can you then say, I didn't know who God was? And second, أو تقولوا إنما أشرك آباؤنا من قبل وكنا ذرية من بعدهم. Or you can't pass the buck and say, well, I followed in the footsteps of shirk, but actually it was my forefathers, my parents, my grandparents. They're the ones who were mushrik. I was just following in their footsteps. You can't say that. You can't pass the buck. The buck has to stop with you. Why? Because you personally met Allah. If you didn't meet Allah, if you didn't have this exchange with Him, then you could say, well, I wasn't there. I assume my parents knew what they were talking about, so I followed them. You'll say, no, you were there in the meeting. You had the exchange, you met Allah, you agreed that yes, He is your Lord. How can you now claim that it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault? How can you claim that you didn't have knowledge of Him, that you didn't recognize Him? Right, so this verse is known, these two verses together, 172 and 173 of Surah Al-A'raf, are known as Ayatul Mithaq. There are two primary interpretations of our scholars for this verse. One interpretation says that this is actually a historical event. Historical, I'm using that term loosely because it's before creation. That at some point in our existence, a lot of ahadith mention this as a story that in the very beginning of creation, when Allah just created the light of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, from them He created all the lights of all humanity, and they were all arranged in what's known as Alam al-Dhar. Dhar means a small ant. So it's like as though we are all little ants, tiny creatures, representing our soul and our intellect, arranged before Allah, and this exchange actually happened at some time. The second interpretation says, no, it's just an allegory. It didn't actually happen in some time. Allah is telling a story. It's as though His existence and His lordship over us is so clear for us, and we have the faculty of intellect to know Him so strong. It's as though He's standing right in front of us, screaming at us, saying, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? Look at all the signs of Allah in the world around you. All of these are pointing towards Allah as your Lord, and you have the sense and the intellect to be able to process all of that. No, it's as though Allah is screaming, Alastu bi rabbikum, and we're replying, Bala, yes, of course you are. And to show that clarity with which we should know God, and God is there in front of us, Allah has painted this parable, this allegory, to paint that picture and make it very clear that we should know Allah as our Lord. So both are valid interpretations. Our Shi'i scholars, there are scholars who have accepted each of these interpretations. Assuming that this was some historical event that took place in our life, one question that arises is, I don't remember. And do you remember that encounter with Allah? Him standing before us saying, Alastu bi rabbikum, and you were replying, Bala? I don't remember, you don't remember. Even the prophets don't remember, and nobody remembers. So what's the point of having this whole thing happen if then nobody has memory? How can He then hold it against us on the Day of Judgment, against those people who don't believe in God, and say, you had no excuse not to know God because you had this exchange with Him? If they can't remember the exchange, then how can you hold them accountable for that meeting? So one answer comes in a hadith where the Imams mention, when someone asks them the same question, I don't remember, they say, بَقِيَتِ الْمَعْرِفَةِ or ثَبَتَتِ الْمَعْرِفَةُ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ وَالنَّسُوا الْمَوْقِفِ. All humanity, while they don't remember that event taking place in their own lifetime, the ma'rifah, the knowledge that came from that exchange, has remained in their heart. So this fitrah that we have, this innate knowledge that's programmed into every human being, this hadith is explaining that the way this came into us, the way Allah created it into the fabric of our existence, is through this exchange that took place. Whether we remember it or not is irrelevant, because the effects of that are still there with us. Maybe a watered down example of something like this is sometimes the effects of what happens in childhood on you as an adult. Right? Psychologists will tell us that there are certain things, certain ways that you might treat your child as a child, even before they have any consciousness. Right? If you're very positive, very encouraging, very loving, right? And then say the parent dies. Within 2 years of the child's life, after showing all that love and compassion and all of that, the parent dies, and the child doesn't have any more contact with that parent. But the effect of that love and the caring that the parents showed will last a lifetime for that child. Even when the child is an adult and is conscious, they'll have no memory of the actual parent, no memory of any of the exchanges. But the positive reinforcement and those good things that were given to them, they'll last a lifetime, and they'll always have increased self-confidence because of that, for instance. And the opposite is also true. A child who's been abused and who's been told he's no good and these kinds of things when they're tiny, even before they understand anything, that effect will last a lifetime, even after they forget they can't remember the abuse, but they see that they have no confidence, that they're always angry and depressed, and they don't like anyone, they can't get along with people. Why? Because their parents treated them very badly as children, even before they remember anything. Right? Just to say that the effect of something can last even though you don't remember the cause of that effect. And so maybe it's something similar to that this interchange happens between us and Allah. We don't even remember the actual exchange, but what we do have with us now is the ma'rifah, the knowledge of Allah. We recognize Allah in our being. And it's with absolute certainty that a person knows God. Then what about atheists? What about people who deviate and leave God and say, no, I don't actually believe in God anymore. I don't even know if God exists. It is possible, this fitrah, you can be distracted from it. I'll give another example from some of the other aspects of fitrah. So we have, for instance, like I mentioned, we have, you could say, a desire for the opposite gender. Right? That is part of our fitrah. Right? But people can, through environmental factors, through upbringing, through improper exchanges, improper exposure to different elements of society, they can become distracted from that fitri desire for the opposite gender, and they end up having other kinds of desires, either for the same gender or for inappropriate partners and things like that. This is not that they have lost their fitrah, but they have substituted something else and satisfied their fitrah with an improper substitute. I mean, it's a simpler example is I'm hungry, I want to eat, I enjoy some meat. Now I can either eat halal meat or I can eat haram meat. My fitrah is going to be drawn towards that which is halal. Maybe not in a conscious way, I won't know the difference. If you give me both in a blind test, I may not know the difference. But one is going to agree with my fitrah because there's spiritual effects to that food as well. That which is not only halal but also the dabiha, it's mudakka, that's going to agree with my soul. That which is, if you give me something as najis and non-dabiha, or pork or something else, that's not going to agree with my soul. I can eat it, it'll satisfy my hunger, and I can finally convince myself that this is fine, this is good enough for me. It satisfies my nutritional needs. But it doesn't fit with my fitrah because it's going to have effects on my soul that I may not be able to perceive. Right, some hadith tell us that one of the effects of eating pork is that pigs lack ghayra. They lack any sense of honor. And so by eating pork, that you also lose that sense of ghayra, that sense of honor, that how dare you look at my wife, how dare you look at my daughter in an inappropriate way. I feel protective, I feel angry and protective of the women who are under my authority, under my care. Right, that's a good sense of honor, and what's called ghayra in Islamic ethics. One of the effects of eating pork is that you lose that. You don't care if someone looks at your daughter, looks at your wife in an inappropriate way. You say it's okay, that's his right. Right. You lose that sense of honor that you're going to defend the women who are dear to you and you have a responsibility over. All right. So this is the fitrah. It's because of this fitrah that Allah has planted within us that we know God. So many of the ahadith will say, because of this exchange in the mithaq, because of this fitrah, this is why all of us know who our Khaliq, who our Raziq, our creator and our sustainer is. Right, so this fitrah that is extremely important, we'll see, as I mentioned, in some of the other pathways to knowing God, that our real effort is to try to strengthen this fitrah, to hone this fitrah, so it becomes a more and more conscious, presential knowledge that I know God constantly. I feel His presence constantly. I constantly feel like I'm completely dependent on Him. And this constant feeling of taqwa, that I always know that He's looking and watching, and I always want to make sure I'm doing what's pleasing Him. Right? All of that is a very healthy and very robust fitrah that I've been able to nurture within myself, that I have this kind of constant consciousness of Allah, and constant awareness of His presence. And that is the ultimate goal. If we're trying to know God, that's the goal. Allahumma ballighni bi imani akmal al-iman. In the beginning of Makarim al-Akhlaq, we ask Allah to make our iman reach the highest level of iman, the most perfect kind of iman. And that's the goal. As we learn more about Allah, we believe stronger in Him, and we believe stronger in Him in a correct way, then our service to Him, inshallah, will also be commensurate, much greater. Salawat Let's revisit the story of Imam Hussein to finish off the majlis. When we left the story, he was in Medina traveling to Mecca. On his way out of the city, he encounters a person by the name of Abdullah bin Mutir. And he's a well-wisher of the Imam, and he asks the Imam, where are you going to? I've heard about the situation, Yazid and Muawiyah, and the demand for bay'ah. Where are you going to go? Imam Hussein says, my first move is to travel to Mecca, to the Haram of Allah. After that, I'll do istikhara, meaning I will seek the best from Allah, the best course of action. I don't yet know exactly what my next move will be after Mecca, but the first move is to Mecca. Abdullah bin Muti says, this is great. I would advise you to just remain in the Haram. And if you have to go anywhere, do not go to Kufa. Because he says, you remember what kind of place Kufa is. It's a place where nothing good happens. Despite the fact that it's the most blessed place after Mecca and Medina on earth, but so many bad things have happened in Kufa for you and your ancestors. Think of where Amir al-Mu'mineen was martyred. It was in Kufa. Think of where your brother Hassan was betrayed by his own people and abandoned. That was Kufa. So he says, if you go anywhere, don't go to Kufa. The Imam says, thank you for your advice. I will make my best decision, but right now I'm heading to the Haram as a mu'tamir, to do Umrah, eventually to do Hajj. So he goes through Masjid al-Shajara, puts on his ihram along with his Ahlul Bayt, all his companions. They don their ihram and they enter into the Haram. And they travel on to Mecca. When they get to Mecca, a lot of people have already gathered there. Abdullah bin Zubayr secretly had traveled by night off the main road and had got to Mecca. Imam Hussein, when he traveled, he refused to do that. Everyone advised him, why don't you do what Abdullah bin Zubayr did, avoid the main roads and travel by night and sneak off. Imam says, I'm not going to do that. This is what I'm doing is the most dignified way. I'm not a robber in the night that I have to escape like that. And so he moves in a very dignified way to Mecca. And when he gets there, Abdullah bin Zubayr is already calling people towards himself. He performs his rituals around the Kaaba. He stands there, sits there, and he lectures to people, calls people towards himself because he has political aspirations. Like his father before him, and actually worse than his father before him. And Zubayr and Talha, after being devoted companions in service to Rasulullah, devoted companions to Amir al-Mu'mineen for many years, when finally Amir al-Mu'mineen got the Khilafah, people came around to him, they thought this is our time to cash in now. And from that height of Iman and companionship where they had been, they sunk to the level of lectures trying to get their share from Amir al-Mu'mineen. They demanded that they should have some post of governorship over Kufa and Basra. And then they finally, when they didn't receive that, they led a rebellion against Amir al-Mu'mineen in the Battle of Jamal and actually fought against him and were killed by his army. This Abdullah bin Zubayr is blamed by historians for the misguidance of his father Zubayr. And this is now the Abdullah bin Zubayr who has political aspirations, and he feels he is actually more worthy than Hussein of taking over the reins of government. But he sees also that as soon as Hussein comes into the Haram, everyone is distracted from Abdullah bin Zubayr and they all go rally around Hussein, even though Hussein is not making any call. They all follow him, they all ask him, they all learn from him, and nobody has any interest in Abdullah bin Zubayr. And so he realizes within himself, he feels very jealous, and he realizes that as long as Hussein lives, there's no place for me in the political realm. Imam Hussein spends some days in Mecca. The people of Kufa, in the meantime, they hear about what has gone on. They hear about Muawiyah's death, they hear that Yazid has made a claim, and they also hear, very interestingly, that Hussein has refused to give bay'ah. And this gives them aspirations that we can once again have another chance at what we failed to do with Amir al-Mu'mineen and with Hassan al-Mujtaba, and we should invite him to Kufa, and from Kufa we launch a proper rebellion against Yazid and finish this matter off once and for all. So the elders of the Shia in Kufa gather in the house of Sulaiman ibn Surad al-Khuzai, one of the elders amongst the Shia. He gathers the likes of Habib ibn Mudahir and others in his home, and he lays out the matter that this is what has happened. They all come to an agreement that we should write to Hussein and invite him to Kufa. And so they write letters, they send it with messengers to Imam Hussein. Within a few days, all of the Shia of Kufa follow suit, and within the span of a few days, a couple of hundred letters are sent. Each of those letters contains signatories and representatives of up to a few thousand people. Because in a tribal system, when the tribal chieftain signs and agrees to do something, then 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 8,000 people under him also follow suit. And so these 150 or so letters that go to Imam Hussein say that the fruit is ripe, the time has come, and when you come to Kufa, you have an army with swords at the ready to support you. And they send these letters off to Imam Hussein in Mecca. Imam Hussein is encouraged by this. He's wary of the past, but he's encouraged by this show of support. He says that my next move then is to test them and examine them to make sure that what they've written in their letters is truly their intent. He says, for this purpose, I call on my trusted companion and my cousin, Muslim bin Aqil. He calls on him and writes the letter to the people of Kufa, and he sends this letter with Muslim bin Aqil to say, go there, see if they are truly of the same mind as what I see in their letters, and if they are, write to me, and I will be on my way, and we will, inshallah, join forces with them and do what needs to be done. On the day of Karbala, Imam Hussein, in the course of some of his speeches, he calls on these same people of Kufa. The ones who wrote him letters are now the ones who are standing against him with their swords drawn, not for him as Junud Mujannada as they had promised, but they have their swords drawn against him. And he calls out to them and he says, Hajjaj bin Abjar, Amr ibn al-Hajjaj, Shabath ibn Rib'i, and calls out some of these leaders by name and says, I have the letters that you wrote with your signatures on them here in this bag. You invited me with these great intentions. If you now have changed your opinion and you don't want me here, then allow me to return. I am here only because you invited me, because you showed goodwill. If you have now decided that you have none of this goodwill and now you're too cowardly to stand by the words and the promises that you gave, then allow me to return, allow my family to return. Why do you now raise your swords against me when they were supposed to be there for me? We have in the Quran Prophet Shu'aib, who's known as Khatibul Anbiya. He was an eloquent speaker, someone who spoke eloquently, guided his people eloquently. When he spoke, despite his eloquence, his people said, Ya Shu'aib, ma nafqahu kathira mimma taqul. We don't understand what you're saying. He was speaking eloquently. The words were clear. Their hearts were too hard to receive. On the day of Karbala, the response that Imam Hussein gets from these Kufans, those who had written those letters, is the same as what the people of Madian gave to Shu'aib. Ma nafqahu kathira mimma taqul. We don't understand what you're saying. Their hearts had hardened to such an extent that despite the fact that the evidence was clear in front of them, their own words were there written in front of them, they declared that they not only don't know what those letters are, what's written in those letters, that they never sent them in the first place, but now they raise their swords against Imam Hussein and say that because of your stand against the rightful Khalifa, we will kill you and kill all of your family and all of your companions while you suffer of thirst. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bi fina'ik alayka minni salamullahi abadan ma baqit wa baqiya al-layl wa an-nahar wa la ja'alahu Allah akhir al-ahdi minni bi ziyaratikum. Assalamu ala al-Husayn وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, help us to increase our knowledge of you. Help us to believe stronger and more perfectly in you. And help us to do actions that are matching those beliefs and that knowledge. Help us to always act in your service, to avoid anything that angers you. And accept this meager commemoration of Imam Hussein and allow us to benefit from his shafa'ah inshallah on the day of judgment. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.